Okay, I think let's get started. I just want to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. My name is Paula Houghton. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at Foundations, Inc. And before we get started in just a minute here, I want to give you a little bit of background about Foundations. We're a national education nonprofit located in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And our mission is to improve the quality of education by building the skill of educators. We work across the school day with after-school programs, schools, districts, and states to create a brighter future for every child every day. If you're interested in learning more about Foundations, you can take a minute to follow us on social media, and I'll drop that info in the chat. You may already know us from our signature professional learning experience, the Beyond School Hours Conference. Our conference is held each year in February, and in 2024, we are going to be in New Orleans from February 14th to 17th, which is one day after Mardi Gras. We'd love to have you all there to join us. If you are interested in joining, because it is the day after Mardi Gras, we highly recommend that you start booking your plane tickets and your hotels now because stuff goes fast for that stuff. So right now, without any further ado, I would love to introduce my colleague, Jana List, who is here today to talk to us about learning through leading, a tiered leadership model for adolescents. Jana, take it away.
Hey, Paula, thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to be with you all and to be talking about how we can effectively engage our teens in youth leadership in a really meaningful and transformational way. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Jana List. I'm an education specialist in the Center for After School and Expanded Learning. In that capacity, I run programs, I do evaluation, and I travel all over the country to do professional development as well. So I feel very lucky to get to do both virtual and in-person professional development on behalf of Foundations. So Paula, thank you for having me here for this virtual webinar today. And I hope I see many of you at Beyond School Hours in person in New Orleans. And as Paula mentioned, we are dedicated to improving the outcomes for children through working with the adults that work with children. And within the center, we do professional development, we present at conferences, we also do evaluation and coaching, and we also develop some content as well. So we do a lot of different things in the center and really have the opportunity to work across the out of school time environment to support educators and support programs. So for today, we are going to identify the skills and characteristics that adolescents need to be successful leaders in out of school time. We're going to define what is tiered leadership in the out of school time environment. And we're going to talk about how we can prepare students, staff, and stakeholders to implement a tiered leadership approach for adolescents. So we have a lot to get through. I hope you will all participate throughout this webinar, joining me in the chat box through some annotations and some other opportunities for engagement. So let's just get started with thinking about why we care so much about integrating youth leadership in out of school time. And that might be a simple question for you. That might be you are interested in increasing your student attendance, or it could be that you want to prepare students for their future lives and careers and potentially leadership opportunities outside of your out of school time environment. There are a million different reasons to want to promote and to work with our students to give them more leadership opportunities. And really, I believe that out of school time is the perfect environment for that because we have the potential and the ability to form meaningful relationships with our students and to really engage them in ways that aren't always possible within the structures of the traditional school day. So as we are talking about what youth leadership looks like, I want us to have a shared definition of effective youth leadership. Our definition is youth leadership is developed in environments where skill development is encouraged through hands-on participation and by recognizing that youth experiences are transformed by the youth who participate in them. So we really want to take a focus on seeing after school time and youth leadership as a transformational opportunity. And we really have the potential, and many of us already have environments that students have a lot of hands-on learning participation and their views are valued and encouraged. So what we're going to be talking about today is really what kinds of leadership skills do students actually need? So this is your first chance to share. I'd love to hear from you in the chat box. What leadership skills do you think your students need to be successful in your program and in life? We would love to hear from you in the chat box. If you want to take just a moment to type your answers into our chat box, let us know. What skills do your students need to be successful? What leadership skills do your students need? And these can be skills that you're already integrating into your out-of-school time environment, or they can be skills and practices that you're thinking about but haven't quite integrated yet. So let's hopefully hear from some of you. Somebody mentioned communication skills, organization, problem solving, self-advocacy, self-regulation, confidence. Yes, we know that adolescence is one of those moments where students may struggle and students are going through a lot of changes. So building up that confidence in a safe environment is so important. Start with the end in mind. So long-term thinking. We know our students often might struggle with thinking about the future. So positive mentors. Jenny, I wonder, do you mean for them to
I will call you back.
Sometimes you even get double your weight that you lost.
Okay, no problem. Bye.
Uh-oh. That might mean either finding positive mentors or themselves being positive mentors.
It was more.
All right, just a second more if anyone else has something they want to share before we move ahead. Awesome. So thank you everyone for sharing some of these skills that you believe your students really need. And these are some great ideas that we are thinking that we can think about and really talk about. Tiered leadership, which we will define in just a moment, creates opportunities for students to develop just some of these skills and many others as well. So that is something that I'm looking forward to talking about some more. So let's jump on ahead. Now, many of these that you mentioned, I have on screen. A few of these I just want to highlight. They didn't get called out. So we didn't hear about accountability, which is, I think, one of the most important skills that we really want to teach our young people, because sometimes we make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but it's really important for students to take responsibility for their actions, to be willing to answer to their community, and to really be accountable to themselves and to others. Compassion is another one that I think is really important and is one we want to emphasize through tiered leadership, because that is a form of leadership where we want to be understanding. We don't want our students to be dictatorial. We want them to build connections, build community, and compassion is going to be essential to that. And as will be problem solving, which many of you mentioned, resilience, because sometimes things don't go quite as expected and you have to be able to, pick yourself up and keep going. So thank you everyone for sharing. And here are just some other ideas. And I'd love to know from you, as now we are thinking about these youth leadership skills, what skills do your students most need? So really thinking about if there's any skills that you've noticed your students are currently struggling with that they really need, you can use the annotation tool. And if you click on text, you can write your answer right on the screen. If you would prefer, you are also welcome to add to the chat box, whatever you want to let us know what are the highest needs for your students. So really, we're just looking to hear. We've heard already about what are some of these student leadership skills. Are there any existing needs within your program? I'd love to hear from you in the chat box or on the screen using the annotation tool. either one, whatever you're most comfortable with. Now, you may be wondering, Rosa mentioned listening skills. You may be wondering, how do I know what my students need? A lot of that can come through either your own observations or observations and giving surveys to faculty, to staff, to after school staff as well, to really find out what students seem to excel in and what they struggle with. So Rosa mentioned listening skills. I would guess, and Rosa, if you want to share what made you think that listening skills are a high priority and a big need for your students, we'd love to hear. But listening skills, that might be you've heard students arguing and talking over each other and not really understanding and making sense of what other people say, just as an example. So we can find out what our students need often through observations, either our own or gathering observations from school day staff, from after school staff, to really find out what our current students most need. So maybe your students are already really responsible. They are great about keeping track of deadlines, but they still need to work on some of those interpersonal skills. Or they're really responsible, but they tend to struggle when things go wrong. So we need to give them opportunities to practice resilience. So those are just some of the ways we might know that students need support. Now, as we're thinking about leadership, we know that all of our students, whether they are leaders just in our programs or they're going to take on leadership roles into adulthood, they are going to need to be adaptable to the changing environment, to changing relationships. They need to be able to solve problems as they come up. That's contextual problem solving. And they need to have empathy. They need to understand the perspectives of others. They really need to have that connection to their community that we've talked about a little bit already. So as we're thinking about what that leadership can and should look like, we want to think about what our student leaders do. And what we want our students to be able to do as effective leaders is we want them to take initiative, especially with our adolescents. We don't want all our students to really depend on having an adult tell them what to do, give instructions. We want our students to be willing and able to take initiative to lead their own programs and activities. And that's what we're really going to dive into today with tiered leadership. We want them to be able to manage projects. We want them to be able to really go from start to finish on individual projects, things they're passionate about, to really give them the opportunity to take ownership in a way that they often don't have those kinds of opportunities in the school day. We want them to be able to connect with their peers, have those positive relationships, and to reflect on their learning. So really effective learners are able to think about and understand both what they've learned, the significance, what they might change in the future, really have those critical thinking skills, even as adolescents, to understand the significance of their learning and what they can do in the future to improve. And so we want to introduce a new model for leadership, and this is called the tiered leadership model. It's a leadership model for adolescents. And this is really a very different approach to youth leadership compared to really any other types of leadership that you have probably encountered or seen before. And really, unlike other leadership programs, or leadership approaches that exist within the context of staff support, tiered leadership is really about taking as much responsibility off adults and moving it onto students while giving students a safe framework, really giving them the opportunity and the environment where they lead activities, programs, design from start to finish. So it's a really radical shift to how we implement our programs. And so in the tiered leadership model for adolescents, there are 4 layers. So students start with developing leadership for themselves, those internal leadership skills. Then they begin to develop leadership over others, their peers. Then they take on leadership of leaders, and that can take the role of being a leader in the organization, including leadership in relation to the adults in the organization. And then finally, organizations, having a seat at the table for running an organization. And again, we want to think about this really differently from other leadership models, because this is a way for us to let students take center stage in all that we do and let students have the opportunity to be the drivers of our programs, be the drivers of how we implement learning opportunities. And I think the best way to understand this is to really think through this as a example, as a scenario that we can work through and solve together. So I want to share with you first a really big picture view of how tiered leadership is different. And then we'll dive into problem solving a program scenario from a tiered leadership approach. I also shared in the chat box the handout that goes with this presentation. So please do download that, take a look at it, and you can use that to follow along with today's webinar. Oopsie. I apologize, I accidentally opened that. All right. So tiered leadership is different for a couple of different ways. So most of our organizations are really structured in a top-down fashion. That means that up at the top, you have your your organization director. If you're in a school district, that might be a superintendent. If you're a nonprofit, that might be a CEO, an executive director. And then there are people with slightly fewer responsibilities, maybe project directors or department heads. And then you have, going all the way down to frontline staff. And then finally, you have students at the very bottom, and students have few, if any, responsibilities for the organization. And so that is what we would call a top-down leadership structure. Very linear, very clear who's in charge of what. Tiered leadership is a really radical change where we go from that top-down approach to more of a horizontal organizational structure. So rather than having the CEO makes all the decisions, everything is final, and students have few, if any, responsibilities, we bring a lot more of our responsibilities to a shared level. That means building more consensus, doing a lot more shared decision making. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not individuals who are responsible for specific tasks. You probably still need an accountant, but it does mean that we broaden the scope of who is involved in decision making, including not just the adults of your program or your organization, but also the students. Now, in a organization that has a top-down structure, generally the decision-making is done by the people at the top, and they instruct everyone else, this is what we're going to do. They tell students, this is the activity you're going to engage in, and then that's what everybody does. Rather than having that, again, very top-down approach, we in tiered leadership can move to a consensus building process. So rather than the project director saying, you're going to participate in X, Y, and Z activities, engaging in and facilitating conversations with students to find out what they're interested in and to build consensus. Now, I do want to really define how this differs from something that many of your programs probably already do, which are interest surveys. Those are great. I'm not criticizing that at all. But interest surveys are a tool you use probably to guide which vendors you bring in or what clubs will be offered, but they are not generally used to structure the program or even to structure the activities. So if students express an interest in dance, they might have an opportunity to participate in a dance club, but they are not deciding what types of dance are going to be done, how it will be taught, when it will be taught, what materials they need, if they will go to any events or anything like that. So I do want to make that clear that there is a difference between just getting student interest versus building consensus, having those active conversations with students where they have the opportunity to sometimes disagree and finally reach shared conclusions. And finally, we want to define how this differs for the adults in the program. So many of the adults in your programs, they are frontline staff, so they are facilitators, they lead clubs either that they're interested in or your students are interested in, or things that they have expertise in, or homework help, any of those things. When we do tiered leadership, when we move to a tiered leadership model, we take a step back from that. Rather than the adults serving as facilitators, they instead serve as supporters. They can be there to help the adolescents make decisions, to guide, to have those meaningful discussions, but they are not there to make decisions on behalf of students. Their role is not to guide any events. It is instead there to support, to be the cheerleader. The guide on the side is a term we often hear, but it's really about stepping aside. But it is not the case that we don't need our staff. It just means that the responsibilities, the roles of our staff have to change. Now let's take a look at this scenario. And what I would like to do with you all today through this scenario is problem solve it from the perspective of tiered leadership. What does tiered leadership look like in this scenario? So the scenario is as follows. The students in your after-school newspaper club are interested in careers in journalism. They want your program to further invest in your journalism program, but your budget for this grant cycle is already set. Luckily, you'll be applying for the next grant cycle. So you are, say, a 21st century program applying for funding. What does leading themselves look like for the students? Now, if you're not sure, leading yourself is where you develop a really strong personal understanding, you clarify your own goals. That's a lot of that internal work. And those are many of the leadership skills that we highlighted earlier. The confidence, that is part of leading yourself. The the problem solving, that is also can be an internal process. So a lot of those internal processes. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat box. What does leading yourself look like in this scenario? And you can let us know in the chat box, share what are students doing if they're leading themselves in this scenario. I can share as an example that maybe a student who is thinking about this interest in journalism for their career, and a student thinking about this in the context of tiered leadership, is probably thinking about doing some more research to identify if there's particular pieces of journalism that they're particularly interested in, whether you're interested in writing book reviews or being an editor or being a photo reporter or photojournalist, excuse me, I forgot the word for that for a second. Clarifying for yourself what your goals are and being really clear on what you want for yourself. Now, when we get to leading others, that, again, I agree with you, Lene, is about teamwork and cooperating with others. And so maintaining that communication is going to be really important. Others is generally what our students will think of as their peers. So that's where students want to share their ideas really build consensus. That's a word that I've mentioned already. But really what tiered leadership about is coming to shared decisions. And so that cooperating piece is going to be really important because our students need to really have the opportunity to discuss, sometimes to disagree. A student newspaper can look like a lot of different things. Is it going to be a weekly? Is it going to be a monthly? Is it going to be more of a literary magazine? Are they going to only report on the program? Or are they also going to report on the community, on world events? There are so many options. And during this leading others piece, it's really the onus is on the students to do that consensus building, and that'll sometimes mean disagreeing together, and doing that communication together. And so for an adult, there definitely needs to be an adult in the room to help support this conversation, but it's only going to be the role of the adult to step in case of a safety issue, or if it feels like students are stuck. And if you're stepping in when students are stuck, that might just look like asking some questions to get them more engaged. It's again really about students taking a leadership role. So these are the types of leadership that we're probably most familiar with. Students either leading themselves, and by that we mean really having that self-understanding and being really clear on their own goals. Leading others is leading their peers. And that's really something that they do quite a lot of in our programs, in many of our programs already. When we get to leading leaders, this is where things start to change. And these are things that are sort of unique to the tiered leadership model. When it comes to leading leaders, that's really about bringing together, again, building consensus, not just within a small group of students talking about the newspaper that they want to have for their next program cycle, but bringing together consensus across groups with other leaders, so other people that have led discussions. And this is where that slightly more horizontal leadership structure really plays in. Because if some students are in charge of thinking about the kind of newspaper that we're going to have for next year, and they've met in their small group and they've really come up with some solid ideas, but then they meet with another group that was having a conversation, but they came to a different answer. This is really about going from a large group. So if you have, 50 high school students, they have the opportunity to work in their small groups. That's where they lead others. And then they come together and build consensus at that with those leaders, people who are sort of elected as representatives. And finally, lead organizations. And this is something in this scenario, remember in this scenario, they're thinking about a journalism program. For their grant cycle, for this next grant cycle, you told them, well, we don't have the budget now, but it's almost time to apply. What would leading an organization look like for students in the context of this scenario? If students are really interested in journalism, what would that leadership look like? We'd love to hear from you in the chat box. So when they shared strategic planning, that's a great idea. So if your program probably has a strategic planning committee or a team, having students develop a strategic plan, maybe having students representatives on your strategic planning committee, those are great ideas. Yes. We'd love to hear any other ideas in the chat box. We mentioned that you're in this scenario, you're planning to apply for the next grant cycle. So that could be students learning how to apply for a grant and doing some of their own grant writing, writing out how this journalism program will benefit them in alignment with either federal or state goals or funder goals, wherever the funding is coming from. I'd love to hear any other ideas from the chat box. But again, really tiered leadership is a slightly radical approach because it's about saying that not only do we want students to develop these skills for the future, but they can and should practice them in the present. So if you have students sitting on the strategic planning committee and students had already come together, built consensus, come up with their own version of the strategic plan, they had to use a lot of leadership skills. They had to use interpersonal skills. They had to use a lot of those more hard skills like computer science and math because they have to think about budget. They've already done some problem solving because they have to think about what will we do if we experience challenges. So in this case where they're doing some of that leading of an organization, they're using a lot of those leadership skills that you all mentioned earlier. And again, we're giving students opportunities to lead as adolescents, take meaningful leadership roles, transformational leadership roles. So we don't want our programs to be a place where our teens just show up and have fun because we do want them to have fun, but we also want them to be meaningfully engaged. And we know, many of us know that with high school students in particular and middle school students as well, they're the hardest to get in the door. One of the ways we can really engage them and make them excited about program time is to make sure that they feel like they have autonomy within our programs, that they feel not just that they feel, but they do have autonomy. They do have responsibility in our programs. They have a responsibility to themselves and to others. And so using these leadership skills today will help them gain that confidence, will engage them in our programs, and will also serve as a building block to all of their futures. Now, if you're thinking, I do want to meaningfully engage my students, I do want to increase opportunities for student leadership, what we have to really think about and talk about is the fact that this change is not something that happens overnight. Instead, we need to think about the process called readiness for change. And what that means is that we have to make sure that our programs are appropriately set up, and that means our students, our staff, our leaders, for this change. And readiness for change has three general components. To start off with, we have the culture. Your culture really has to be an environment where your cultural norms are aligned with the goals. So what are your cultural norms? Your program might have a vision statement or a mission. Is your vision and or mission aligned with student leadership that is really transformative? So do you have a statement in your vision or your mission statement about how students will meaningfully lead programs and develop independence, just as an example? So we may want to make sure that we have this goal written out. And then we want to develop those norms, have really frequent conversations with staff, with students, to make sure that everybody buys in to the idea that youth leadership is valuable, youth leadership is transformational, and youth leadership is possible in the out-of-school time environment. Now, once we've done that and we've really made sure that we have a culture that is really focused on youth leadership, we can then we then need to make sure that we have the commitment to this tiered leadership approach. Now, it's important to know that tiered leadership is not a leadership approach or a transformation that happens in the short term. It really may take some programs several years to make a complete transformation from a program that is really guided by adult decisions to a program that is led by students, that is really designed from that youth-led perspective. So we need to both have the commitment of willingness to stick it out, to do this work over the period of often years. And we also need to make sure that all of our staff understand why this is so valuable. So not just that we think that students will benefit from this, but also we need our staff to understand that they will really benefit from, both adults and youth, will benefit from this tiered leadership model, and really are interested in seeing that change, because the change might not happen immediately. It might take a few years to really start to see a shift in both program implementation and student engagement. And finally, we have to think about program capacity. Now, program capacity is really, does your program have the staff, the knowledge, the skills to make this possible? Do your staff understand what youth leadership? Do you understand what youth leadership looks like? Do you have the budget to offer trainings if additional training is necessary? Do you know enough about the history of your program to know what has been tried before and what you still need? Do you understand the skills your students have and which ones they still need to develop? Capacity is really what we think about last in this process of readiness for change, because that is where we are thinking about the practicals of, we really have this commitment, our culture is ready. Now, if we are going to actually start to implement tiered leadership, we need to make sure everything is prepared, because this is a process, this transformative process is going to depend on really having so many moving parts working together. So we need to make sure that we're ready, that we have all our ducks in a row, as the saying goes. Now, if you're thinking, what does a culture that really values and sees the meaning of youth leadership looks like? It should be a culture that sees youth as assets. The adults in your program need to be willing to share power. So we know that sometimes it can be really hard to step aside and let students make mistakes. We want to jump in and help rescue them. We want our staff to be willing to have these kinds of relationships where they step back, are willing to see students struggle sometimes, because students will struggle sometimes, and to give them the opportunity to learn from those very mistakes, because sometimes the best way to learn is to stumble along. And what our programs offer is a safe environment where students can try new things, a safe environment where students can fail and learn from those mistakes. We also need to be willing, and our staff need to be willing, to have some flexible expectations. Teenagers are teenagers. They're not always going to make the decisions that we would advise them. They're not always going to think things through. That's where they are developmentally. So we want to make sure that any staff that are involved in a tiered leadership program understand that and have some flexibility in what we expect from students, in what successful outcomes look like, because things will change. Tiered leadership, again, because it's student-centered and it's focused on consensus building. This is an approach where our outcomes might differ from what we were planning on from the very start. And we need to have some flexibility and understanding that things change. Now, we also need to make sure that we have the capacity for youth leadership. And so the capacity is really what we look at of, do our staff know what to do? Do our staff have really strong relationships with our students? Do students have really strong relationships with each other? And do we actually have the time to implement this? Are we planning on implementation over the period of 2 to 3 years, understanding that this is a long-term process? So we need to make sure that we're prepared. This might involve bringing in additional staff or training experts to really teach your staff how to really release that responsibility, give that responsibility to students, how to form stronger relationship with students that they might have already. So those are really opportunities for building the skills, the knowledge of your students, your staff, your leaders. Having those diverse experiences will make for an even richer learning experience as students participate in the tiered leadership model, because they can learn from each other. They've already had some training, they can continue to learn and grow. So I'd love to hear from you in the chat box. If you're thinking youth leadership is something I really want to focus on, what is one way through your commitment that you're going to show your commitment to youth leadership? So as a reminder, commitment is really where we make sure that everyone is resolved and understands the value, is really ready to include tiered leadership at every level of the organization, and really sees this as an integral part of the learning experience. So we'd love to hear from you as you're thinking about your own programs. How do you, or how can you show your commitment to tiered youth leadership, or youth leadership in general? We'd love to hear from you in the chat box. I'll give you just a few seconds to respond. So I want to highlight what Jenny said, because I think this is such a great point. And I'm really excited to hear more. Jenny says that she currently leads a youth-led program, but it is challenging to kind of step back. Many of us come from other educational contexts or professional contexts where we've had leadership experiences. And when you see students make a mistake, it's really tempting to step in and say, let me help you do this correctly. Let me help you make sure that this upcoming event is a success instead of a failure. But we all encounter failure at some point in our lives. But I think one thing that's really important to know is that when students fail in our out of school time environments, they're really doing that in an environment where it's safe, they're supported, they have strong relationships. And that creates an opportunity for them to bounce back, because they struggle, they maybe stumble a little bit, and they get right back on again because they have people there cheering them on. And that can be a big role for us, cheering our students on. When they mentioned that her program is starting a youth council for the after school program, I am very interested in hearing what you plan to have your youth council do. And remember, this is not an all of a sudden approach. So in the next year, it could be that the youth council is responsible for planning an event or two so that they gain those initial skills. Then it could be that they don't just plan a special event, that they organize, plan, and implement an entire club, either for their peers or for younger students. And then in years after, that could include students sitting on your leadership board, or if you have an advisory committee for your organization, having students sit on those. So the next time you apply for funding, if you're applying for grant funding, having your students serve as part of that. So Melissa shared that she has youth who are paid to tutor younger students. Oh, great. So Melissa shares that one of her challenges in her program is getting the adults to comfortably interact with teens. So relying on them and guiding them, because many of them are more closely experienced with elementary school teachers, and we know our teens are a little bit different. So Melissa, that might be a case of thinking about the kinds of training you can do with your staff. And this is one where you can really, again, talk about that shared power concept. Talk about the fact that this is both an opportunity for the younger students to grow because they're getting literacy support, and also for the young people who are working in your program to grow. The facilitators might consider using some guiding questions to help prompt students when they need to refocus, or the facilitator the staff person wants to help the students more effectively answer questions for students, or ask really effective critical thinking questions. All of those things are possible, but we have to think about where we are and what our program needs. So does your program already have a culture of youth leadership, or do you have a program where you need to work on cementing that and demonstrating that? We've heard from several of you that already have pretty meaningful leadership opportunities for students, which is wonderful to hear. So thank you everyone for sharing. Now I want to dive into how do we get everyone in our organization ready for tiered leadership, ready for having some really high level student youth leadership. And there's really 3 general groups that need to be prepared for this. So first, you need your leaders. That means the leaders of the after school program. That means the leaders of your organization, potentially the leaders of your school district. Everyone should be on the same page. But those are often not the people, those are generally not the people who work frontline with students. So we also need to make sure our staff are ready. Our staff understand, our staff have bought into the concept of tiered leadership. The staff have bought into really making our program a space that is focused and really driven by student interest. And finally, our students need training. So if you just tell students to organize an event with no practice, with no guidance, with no smaller activity to really prep them and to give them a model, then they're going to really struggle and they're not going to be prepared and set up for success. So our students need some of those skills that we mentioned earlier in this presentation, as well as many others. And so they need training, they need support, they need practice before they take on such a bigger role where the facilitator is really stepping back. Now, for your staff to be ready for change, and Amy is mentioning that this is an area of challenge. Yes, I would say most programs, the challenge is always, or most frequently staff, not because they're resistant, but because it is a huge change from what we're used to, especially those of us who come from backgrounds as school day teachers, where we are used to giving instructions and students following in our instructions, or we're used to standing up the board and lecturing. We are used to a very staff-driven approach to education. This is different. We want our staff to recognize there is a need, that you're not just bringing in this new idea, this new model for leadership just because, but there is a fundamental reason for it. It could be that you've seen that your students are not engaged in high school. So this is an opportunity to get them more engaged because they have a greater sense of autonomy. It could be that you have heard from school day teachers that they're really graduating without the skills they need to live independently. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to figure those things out to solve their own problems. Our staff really need to be conscious of and be ready to communicate in ways that are effective, because we know that we often talk with students. Some of our staff might go by their first names, some might go by their last names, some are much more formal, some are more relaxed. And all of those have a place and all of those can be right. But we really need to make sure that the way we communicate with our young people emphasizes how valuable we find them, emphasizes that we see the meaningful changes and we're responding to those. And really, we need to be prepared to respond to student conflict and failure, because it's going to happen. And so if you have a program where you've never had any behavioral issues, you've never had attendance issues, well, that's amazing. And I congratulate you. But for most of us, these are ways that we can check in on attendance, make sure our students are coming in when they're saying they're coming in. We can make sure that they're having constructive conversations, interacting really positively. So again, we want to have this positive association and these positive opportunities to learn. Now, as we've mentioned, this is one of our greatest challenges. So I'd like to share with you all a little scenario. And in this scenario, my colleague Andrew Francis and I are going to act out. He is going to play our project director, and I'm going to be the site coordinator. And as you're listening, I would love to hear from you in the chat box. What does this project director do well in convincing me, the site coordinator, to implement or to start to adopt tiered leadership? And what are things that are potential areas of growth? What could Andrew improve? Andrew, ready to get started?
Ready to go.
All right, Andrew, off you go.
Let's go. Hi, Sam. I just went to a great conference and I learned a really different way of implementing a program to boost student leadership.
Wow, Sam. Wow, thank you so much for sharing. I'm excited to hear about it.
Oh, I'm so excited. I'm so inspired, Sam. This approach I learned about is called tiered leadership. In this system, students take on all the leadership responsibilities in the organization. They craft the mission, they craft the vision, they schedule the events calendar, and they organize the programs.
That sounds like a lot of responsibility. They're just kids. And what will be the role of staff? It sounds like you just want to replace all the paid employees with students running the program all on their own.
I agree with you, Sam. It's really a lot of responsibility, but I think that they can handle it. I don't think we'll be able to see what our students are really capable of until we challenge them. And this definitely isn't a way to get rid of staff. What will happen is that the role of staff will change, but they are absolutely essential to guide our students as they develop those leadership skills.
Mm-hmm. I understand wanting to challenge kids, but this is a step too far. If we totally change how we do everything, they won't know what to do. I don't think my students have the skills they need to do this. They just show up and do homework and have fun. If we ask our teenagers to run a program, they're just going to quit.
Sam, I hear your concern. And that's why moving from staff leadership to student leadership is a really long-term project. It'll probably take us a couple of years to make the transition because we'll have to teach the students a ton of new leadership skills. And I don't think the teenagers will run away from the program. Teenagers spend the whole school day being told what to do. I think they would love to take a leadership role instead in our program.
You may be right, but I think it'll be hard to get staff to buy into this. I'm interested in promoting student leadership, but I think it's going to take a lot of convincing.
I agree, Sam, but I think we can do it. We just have to focus on the benefits for students, and we can emphasize that they will get a lot of support through the change. Think about it. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Wow, Project Director Andrew, I am so inspired. And I want to share that in the audience, there is a lot of support for you getting an Oscar. I will second I will support all of the people who support your candidacy.
Thank you so much.
Yes, everyone noticed. I heard that really loving the enthusiasm that Andrew shared through that presentation. I, as the site coordinator, was a little hesitant. And when you go and talk to your staff, they might be a little bit hesitant. But Andrew really communicated that this is an exciting opportunity for students and for really changing the way we do things. I also want to highlight that Andrew took the time to address my specific concerns that maybe staff would be replaced with just students running their own programs. He emphasized that this is about giving staff a new role rather than replacing them. Andrew also emphasized or agreed that doing this suddenly would not really work out, that we need to take the time to teach students a lot of new skills so that they can be ready. And so with that in mind, some of the things that we really need to be thinking about as we're getting buy-in, a great way to get buy-in from your students, from your staff, excuse me, is to hook them like Andrew did, told me how excited he was, how great this is. He explained what the benefits would be both to the students. Andrew didn't really address some of the benefits to the staff. That's something that can be really wonderful. So because staff have to learn new leadership skills because it's a very different kind of leadership when you're doing it from the side instead of, just giving direct instruction. It's really important to emphasize that staff still have a role. Staff may be understandably worried about job security. And so the staff need to know that there's a role for them, and they need to know what are they actually going to do. So Andrew and I just did like a 2-minute script, but in a more detailed introduction, you really want to be thinking about how do I make sure that our staff really understand what's happening and they feel comfortable with this. And with that in mind, we'd love to do a little annotation activity. A yes or no activity. So with your interactions, you can use the reaction buttons. You can use a green check mark or a red X. And we'd love to hear from you. Do you think that these quotes from a program leader will build staff buy-in? So here's our first quote. Programs that have implemented tiered leadership have seen incredible growth in teen engagement. Do you think that this quote would build staff buy-in? You can use those reaction buttons along the bottom of your screen to let us know if you think that this will build staff buy-in. Consensus seems to be yes, but if you disagree, if you think this wouldn't be an effective message for your staff, please do share in the chat box why you think that. You know your staff population best. Look at another example. Our program director said that implementing tiered leadership for teens is mandatory. Do you think that this will build staff buy-in into tiered leadership? And you can just click a new reaction button to change your earlier answer. No, I think the consensus is not. I agree with you all. Even though the program director may be making it mandatory, and that's fine, we want to build staff buy-in by showing them what's in it for them, not by forcing it down their throats. So making it part of a conversation, even if it will eventually be required. And let's see one more. Your job will be to encourage students to develop new skills through coaching instead of direct instruction. Do you think that this would build staff buy-in? And you can let us know again with those green checks or red X's. Would this build staff buy-in? Consensus seems to be yes, and I agree with you all, because this is an opportunity to clearly define what staff are going to do so they understand their role, and it's to reassure them that they do have a role in this. It's not just going to be replacing paid staff with students. Now, as we're coming to an end, I would love to check in with you all. We've talked a lot about tiered leadership. We've talked a lot about what youth leadership looks like and what our programs need. I'd love to just hear from you where you are on this continuum of change. So you can use your annotation tool and just let us know on the scale. Are you someone who you're ready for tiered leadership? It's going to be coming to your program very soon. Or did you hear about this new approach or different approach to youth leadership and you thought it was interesting, but it's not right for your program? You can let us know. Just use your annotation tools. You can do any one of the stamps to really share with us. Oopsie, I went too far forward. I'm sorry, everyone. I stopped sharing my screen for a second. That was unintentional. Let us know where you are on this continuum. You really want to do tiered leadership, or it's just not right for your program. We do love to hear from you. It looks like there's some answers coming in the chat box rather than on the screen. Oh, Jenny says she's ready. So Jenny's going to be thinking about making some changes. Sandra's also ready. Awesome. And it's okay if you're not there yet. If you want to learn some more about youth leadership, think about some strategies that'll be effective. That's awesome too. Amy is thinking about starting the conversation with staff. That's a great place to start because, again, building that buy-in is going to be absolutely essential because we're not replacing our staff. We're just shifting some responsibilities. Paul is committed, but learning more. So thank you so much, everyone. Oh, Diana says that it's in line with the school's IB MYP program. So thank you all for sharing. And so as we are finishing up, I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. You can reach us reach me at ywist@foundationsinc.org or at our website, foundationsinc.org, or on any of our social media. If you have a second, please do fill out our feedback form. We'd really appreciate it. And we will see you for the next webinar that it's going to be at the end of July. So thank you everyone so much for taking the time to be with me. And please reach out if you have any questions or there's anything I or Foundations can do to support you. And hopefully I'll see you all in person in February in New Orleans. And Paula, thanks for inviting me to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Yana. You covered pretty much everything I wanted to say anyway. I just wanted to thank you again and thank Andrew for his amazing performance. And I want to thank everyone who attended for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. As Yana said, please do take a minute to fill out the survey. The link was posted in the chat. And we hope you'll join us again when we start these back up with our summer schedule. You can use the link in the chat to sign up for our mailing list so you'll know when it's released. And of course, we hope you'll join us in February for Beyond School Hours, which will be in New Orleans from February 14th to 17th. Thank you again for joining us today. Especially thank you to Yana and Andrew. And I hope to